now than there was yesterday. Yesterday we noticed everybody was kind of wilted, but it's so good to have a little cooler day. And we want to get rolling. We want to remember that there may be some questions, and we're going to keep harping on this because we want to have a very productive question and answer time for our roundtable tomorrow. So if you have questions that have pretty much, it's open-ended, but we're specifically aiming it at the speakers that we've had and are having throughout this week and weekend. So if you have questions, there's a box over here, and you just pick up one of those things and write a question out. And drop it in the offering envelope, or give it to the guys on that back table, or to me, that's fine. Please ask the questions that you're dying to ask, but you don't want to do it in maybe a public setting of raising your hand. Okay? I want to thank Timmy and Richie Brower for being with us this week. I really value, I've listened to some of their stuff online, and I've known them for a while, at least Richie more than Timmy, but I really appreciate their approach and their insights to relationships and their focus upon getting it scripturally founded and based. That's so critical and so important. My wife and I both appreciate that. My wife would be here. She's listening on her device back in the room. She just can't quite make it yet this morning. So I want to have a prayer, and then we'll turn time over to Timmy and Richie. Kind Heavenly Father, thank you so much for giving us relationships. Really, marriage is the quintessential one on this earth where we learn to be loving. But it's all relationships, and the principles that we hear apply to many different relationships that we are connected with. And I pray that you will anoint Timmy and Richie this morning, and that you will help them as they share their story, help us to learn what you have in mind for us to learn from maybe some of the pain that they share, but they're willing to share with us their journey so that it can be helpful to us. We ask your blessing in Jesus' name, amen.
Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for ordering the cooler weather. I can breathe, and so can you, just looking at your faces. So it's good to be here and have that fresh air blow in. Last night, sometime in the middle of the night, I'm not sure what all it blew in with it, but one thing for sure is cooler temperatures, and we'll take it. So glad to be here. I see some new faces this morning who weren't with us yesterday, so just wanted to say welcome and congratulations. You chose to come to to be with us for the first time, where we're kind of diving off the cliff and into the deep end. So we tried to ease you in yesterday. Sorry you missed that. Here we go. And so just a little bit about us. Timmy and I are from Washington State. We live outside of Spokane, Washington, in farm country. In fact, our nearest neighbor is a mile away, and we are surrounded by wheat, lentil, barley, and right now a lot of Kentucky bluegrass farming going on around us. So we love farm country. We're praying for rain in our area because right now our farmers are suffering. They're starting to use the D word, which is not a word we use very often in that particular part, drought. Starting to use the D word, a little nervous about some of the crops where we are this year. But anyway, we're glad to be with you. And this morning, we're going to be kind of sharing more of a linear version of our story. We plug in bits of our story into everything we do, but this morning we're going to kind of give you the down and the dirty. We don't look so great in this particular story.
But let's face it, those of you who heard us yesterday, we weren't very shiny yesterday, were we either? Yeah, so it's all good.
So, sometimes we kind of say, why do we tell our story like this? And I think what we've concluded over the years is we tell our story, and especially our testimony, for a couple reasons. One, while we don't end up looking very good, God does as the hero of our story, and that alone is worth it. And two, we've discovered as we've had the opportunity to travel and share our stories that when we tell our stories, other people connect, because at the end of the day, we can sit together in a room like this and the enemy will whisper in your ear, "You're the only one." But when somebody else tells their story, it's amazing how much our stories sound alike, and all of a sudden you go, I'm not alone, which I think was a big part of the reason God created this thing called the church. So we want to invite you into this journey with us as we share a bit of our story.
And for those of you who had trouble hearing me yesterday, feel free to wave and just like make all kinds of motions. I will do my very best to pet and adore my microphone. And if I forget, feel free to just kind of, and I will start petting it once again.
So you're saying if we see them twitching, we're going to interpret that as a cue.
Right.
All right, if you twitch, she'll raise her microphone. That's what I heard anyway.
This could be a really fun meeting.
And as Timmy reminded some of you yesterday, in this section right here, cued in really. Welcome, by the way. I don't know your name yet, but sitting next to Dan. I've heard lots about you already. Glad you're here.
And we're looking forward to meeting you. Because there's something about, when a husband really likes his wife and says, "Oh, I just can't wait for you to meet my wife," and da-da-da-da-da-da. It's like, we can't wait to meet you because of
We're
how
very
fond
excited
of
you're
you
here.
he is. So,
Small groups, I love it.
It is good.
So now I was going someplace really
Sorry.
important.
We're
Yeah.
gonna talk
So
about
in
pain.
case you haven't figured it out, we like interaction. So this section here yesterday really got into that, and we appreciated it. So dig deep, find your inner Pentecostal, whatever you need to do, but feel free to talk back. That makes us feel at home, and you get better presentations. So you ready?
yeah.
So I'm embarrassed to say how many years ago this happened now, but it's a lot of years. After Timmy and I met at summer camp. We're big believers in summer camp. We met at a little camp called Camp Miveden in Hayden Lake, Idaho. It's a great place to meet a spouse. It's a great place to meet Jesus. But that's where we met, and we became friends and eventually started dating. And after dating and getting to know each other for a long time, we decided that, we should get married. And so I had a bit of a reputation to uphold when it came to creative ways of interacting with girls. And
Wasn't that a good way of wording that?
Yeah. And so I knew that whatever I did to propose to Timmy had to be a really big production, because I was known for productions. And so I started reaching out to friends in the Northwest. We were both at Andrews University at the time, and I said, I need a big boat somewhere in the Pacific Northwest on Christmas break. And a friend reached out and said, I have a friend who has a 43-foot yacht moored on the Columbia River just outside of Vancouver, Washington, and they're willing to let you use it. And I said, done! And so I got my family involved, and I involved all kinds of folks, and we made a big production of decorating this yacht with Christmas lights and dried roses and fresh roses, and we baked a spice cake on board so it'd smell good when she got there. Everything was perfect, except for one itsy-bitsy detail. It was the night before Christmas Eve, and the big 43-foot yacht had a heater that was about this big. And it did not keep up.
There was one other slight problem that
What
you
was
may
that?
not remember. Richie had taken me snowboarding for the first time the day before. And remember how I mentioned I went ka-jing, ka-jing, ka-jing. I was so sore. Like, I went to shower that morning. I couldn't quite raise my arms enough to wash my hair. Because I was so bruised. I'm actually pretty coordinated most of the time, but there's something about a snowboard and I that do not get along. So we make jokes. I couldn't have said no when he asked me to marry him if I'd wanted to. I couldn't even open a door by myself. Like, I was opening doors like this because I couldn't. Yes, so that was the other slight problem.
Yeah, that was not a strategic plan, although there have been questions raised as to whether or not that was strategically planned. But so I proposed, and she was too sore and too cold to say no. Apparently, that's how that went. Is that what I'm Is that what I'm hearing?
I was so ecstatically excited that he asked me to marry him. I mean, come on, that was just humor. I was a pretty happy camper.
We were both pretty happy campers.
Yeah.
So we got engaged, and 9 months later, we had a picture-perfect, beautiful outdoor wedding up in Washington State, and that was the kickoff to married life. And you know, everything just looked great as we drove away from that picture-perfect wedding, except for one thing: we hadn't eaten all day. We were starving, so our first official act was to go find food.
Yes, which we've done a lot of since then.
Yes, we have.
And you know, we were so excited. We were so idealistic. We were, we were going to embark on this new adventure of pastoral ministry. The conference had placed us close enough to Walla Walla that I could commute, because I was only going into my junior year and still had a fair bit of commuting to do. And so we were going off on our honeymoon. I didn't know where we were going. Went to a little island in the San Juans, and it was so good. And then one night on our honeymoon, we found ourselves, me on one side of an inlet and him on the other, thank you for twitching, on the other side of the inlet, because we were realizing we were already hitting bumps we didn't know how to work through. We didn't have the communication skills, and we're both talkers. We have always been talkers. But talking about stuff is different than doing life together. And so we found ourselves on our honeymoon, like I said, on different sides of the bay, trying to figure out, and it wasn't, oh my goodness, what have we done? It was, oh my goodness, I love him so much. Are we going to survive?
That was kind of how it began, and we have said many, many times since then that the wheels of our marriage literally began coming off on our honeymoon. It was not happily ever after for the Browers, and no riding into the sunset. Instead, we're watching the sunset from opposite ends of the beach, as Timmy said. And from that point on, really, as we moved into marriage, you heard us say yesterday that we affectionately refer to the first 12 months of our marriage as the year from hell. It was not a fun ride. And again, all of this in the context of going into our first district, pastoring together, and the suffering happening behind closed doors, and putting on our Sabbath faces and coming out to do our work as a pastoral team.
In our first pastoral assignment, we had a 3-church district with 3 pastors. Them's was the good old days. That's not usual anymore in our conference. But we had such amazing people. And can I just say, be kind to your pastors. Our churches were so incredibly generous to us. We just were down in Pendleton, Oregon last Sabbath to install a new pastor, actually, which is such a funny word, to dedicate them into their new pastorate. And we got to see a bunch of people, and all these feelings of warmth and love flooded us because they were so kind to us. I was 21, still in college, and the pastor's wife, which comes with a ridiculous amount of things you're supposed to do and no one tells you. It doesn't come with a list. They just assume you already know. And I went pretty much from my mother to Richie. How was I going to get that list? But they were so generous to us, and like with their hearts generous to us. And there were probably a few intuitive souls in our congregation who detected that not all was well in pastoral paradise. But for the most part, we kept it concealed because we didn't have any models that said, oh, you can talk about difficulty in real life. Our families certainly didn't, and we had this idea that we had to be as close to perfect as we could possibly be if we were going to be the pastors. And so we did our very best, not because so much we were trying to hide, but because we thought that's what we were supposed to do. Like, we're supposed to be the ones who know stuff. And so we did our valiant best to be as shiny and on fire for Jesus as we could be when we were out, but then we would come back and collapse into patterns of withdrawal and hurt. Richie was very angry at that stage, and there were times like I am being buzzed by a bee. I am not a morning person. My children know if they want me to answer anything that they probably shouldn't ask me a question before 7, ever. Even if I'm up, don't actually talk to me if you can help it. I'm not mean, I'm just not accommodating. And
Just curious where you're going.
And there were times, so Richie is a morning person. Our children took after him, which is good in so many ways, but not this one. And so when we were first married, like Sunday mornings, that was my one day to sleep in because I was commuting to school an hour away for an 8 o'clock class, so I got up pretty early. And like Richie would come and literally bounce on the bed, "It's a beautiful morning, and what are we gonna do today?" And I'd be like, And
I learned fairly quickly that was a bad idea.
But he also resented it. He resented that I wasn't ready to face the day by 6 on a Sunday morning. And so we started these cycles of me disappointing Richie's expectations that he never completely verbalized. And so I was always like, am I doing it right? Am I not doing it right? And he was always feeling disappointed, which then made him angry, and then he would react in anger, and I'm not really keen on anger, so I would just keep distancing, and then he would feel the abandonment of me leaving, so he would pursue hard after me and be like, okay, I am out of here. But then that would make him feel more abandoned, and then he'd withdraw, and I'd be like, well, don't leave me. And then I would try to follow him, because attachment is hard work under, I think, the best of circumstances, and we didn't come from the best of circumstances. No. So that was kind of the pattern of what it looked like in our home while we were outside being as shiny as we could possibly be.
So that was probably the first 3.5 years, I think, we were in that district. And
Yep.
then the conference approached us about an opportunity to move to Spokane, which is the big city in our conference, and plant a new church. And we thought that sounded like a pretty cool, well, at least I did. I think we both did.
Yeah.
We thought that sounded like a pretty cool opportunity. So we did. We moved, and what we didn't know is that all the existing Adventist churches in Spokane had a meeting of the pastors, and the pastors voted not to have a new church planted in Spokane, Washington. So the conference said, well, you're welcome to have that vote, but we're bringing Richie and Timmy Brower to plant a church. And so we didn't exactly have the red carpet rolled out for us in the Adventist community when we arrived.
They actually tried to bar us from their people so that we wouldn't steal their members. It was not an accommodating welcome.
So what we ended up doing was what we call in church planting a cold start. A cold start means you don't have a group of 30 or 40 people to start a church. You start with 2. And fortunately, we had some dear friends that we'd met at Andrews University, and they actually moved to Spokane from Arizona to help us plant a church, and they're still there. And that was our core group. We started with 4 adults and 1 baby. That was the beginning of our church plant. And in case you're wondering, that's a stressful way to begin a church. And the pressure mounted as we try to grow this church from 4 to something that could become an actual church.
And so at this point, I was in graduate school full-time and working full-time. We were church planting full-time. Richie was visiting full-time. Again, trying to get this little baby thing to be birthed and then grow. And to say that our home was stressful would be an understatement, because I worked a full day, and then I was working at a homeless shelter, and I would eat with the residents and then go to school and not get home till 9:30 or 10 at night, and then homework and everything on top of it. It was crazy.
So boundaries maybe were not our strong suit.
Not really.
That would be a fair thing to say. And so
we were young and idealistic.
Foolish would be another word to go with that.
Yes.
Yeah. And the pressure of all that we just said, planting a new church, full-time school, full-time work, the pressure began to mount, and that led to angry outbursts on my part and tearful conversations and just a deepening hurt and a deepening sense that there was something dreadfully wrong in our home. I remember ever since I was a young teenage guy, my way of praying and connecting with God, my favorite place is under the stars at night. I love to go walking under the stars and look up at the sky and pray. And I remember while we were living in that home there in the urban intersect outside of Spokane, I remember going for walks on the driveway at night after things had gone sideways again and just saying, God, I don't know, are we going to make it? I don't know if we're going to survive. What do I do? And really, I was praying that God would help Timmy, because by this point, I had become completely convinced that the real issue in our marriage was Timmy. And if God would simply help her, then we would be okay.
So I was the identified problem for many years because we both have stories of trauma, but mine is very overt, I think we could say. His is not subtle, but we were still learning definitions at that point and the continuum of domestic violence as opposed to just, because, Richie was never hit, so clearly he was in a good enough home. And that's kind of, I think, the mindset we had. And so, but my childhood was clearly really abusive. So I was the identified problem. And what's hard is I agreed with him. He said I was the identified problem. I agreed with him. I'm the identified problem. If I can just figure it out, if I can go to enough counselors, if I can heal enough, then we will be okay. And like I said, I went to, I don't even know how many counselors, and they were good counselors, though as a side note, as a therapist now, it's really important to go to a therapist who specializes in what you need, because not all generalists can deal with all things. And so I went to some really good counselors who were generalist counselors. I needed a trauma therapist. I needed someone who could go into the stuff with me, not someone who got squeamish when I got near it. And I had several who were like, whoo, and I could tell they were scared. Well, I'm not going to tell a scary story to someone who's scared of my story. So, yeah, that's tricky. That's a side note, though. For so many reasons, our progress was incremental. We would almost be on the cusp of oh, we're figuring it out. Marriage is gonna work. And then something would happen. There would be some calamity, large or small, and we would start our cycle of pursuit and withdrawal and anger and fear. And really, the whole thing was just an attachment
Disaster.
That's a great word. I was thinking of choicer words, but I'm not sure if you all want choicer words. It was a disaster. It was a catastrophe. It was a cocktail of awfulness because of how many really hard variables we had going on at once. And so we would almost get there and then would be sucked back into the vortex again.
So during this time, as we're trying to raise up a church, Timmy's in grad school working, all these things are going on, and we're spiraling and struggling and trying to sort things out. I picked up a couple books, and one of them was talking about what it means to be a godly man, biblical manhood, trying to understand, and I had actually never really thought about that in any depth to think, what is my role as a man? What's God asking from me and expecting of me? And frankly, the book started putting some ideas in my head. I'm like, and they weren't bad ideas. They were, by and large, they were good ideas. I started thinking new thoughts, but they weren't necessarily translating into changed behavior, all right? So I'm starting to think, okay, maybe I should do this differently, but I don't know how, and I haven't seen it modeled in my family or other families I've been around, and so the behavior is not changing. In fact, I remember one time Timmy and I got into a loud argument and a pretty good fight, and I remember her with tears running down her cheeks and passion in her voice saying, all these books you're reading and tapes you're listening to, they aren't make you any nicer. And I listened to that and I thought, I can understand that the weight of being responsible for the disaster that is our marriage would become overwhelming. And if I were in her shoes, I would want to push some of that blame onto Richie. I'm just telling you how things were going in my head, okay? So feel free to laugh and throw things if you want. And I thought, right? And I thought, poor Timmy. I can see why she'd want to shift some of the blame, but we both know whose responsibility this is, and that's just where I was at. I was totally dismissive of any role that I might have. And that would give you some sense of the sensitive person that I am. And in fact, I remember one night after we sold our home there in the urban interface and moved out to Elk, our favorite location. We had a driveway in Elk that was about a half-mile long, and we'd gotten into another fight, probably over real estate at that point. We were probably fighting over real estate. And I remember walking the driveway. It was late fall, north of Spokane, and the first snow was falling, those big, fat, juicy flakes, before it cools down and gets serious. And I remember walking down the driveway. Night is falling, snow's falling, and I remember looking up into the sky and snowflakes falling in my face and just saying into the sky, God, is there any part of this mess that's my responsibility? I love having you in the front row.
I feel like I have an ally, and I am grateful.
Yes, you do. And I'm only sharing that to say that's where I was at. I truly believed this was all Timmy's stuff, because I was reading the books and doing the work and thinking hard, and I literally could not see my part in this at all.
Well, and the reality is, we talked yesterday about how our stories impact, and both of us were working out of our stories. In Richie's story, he had to be blameless coming into, and I think by nature, I would say based off of some of the man-children we have created together, that there is a fair level of, oh no, this is not about me. And so I think there could be a genetic component that you didn't have a choice in.
Or they don't.
I don't think it started with you, babe. So in this time frame, we moved out of Elk, thankfully. We bought our place, and we were so excited because we had a sabbatical coming. And what more restful, rejuvenating way to experience a 3-month sabbatical than to build a house with your own 2 hands. Thank you. Thank you for chuckling and going, oh, those poor foolish children. So we actually found, it was a blessing in so many ways, but what we found is that was actually our best time. Working on the house, we didn't argue, we didn't change the church plans, or not the church plans. I meant the house plans. The church plant was going on without us, and well, that's a different story. We'll get to that in a moment. And so we actually, when we were on the work site together, we did really well. But then there was those other days. You can't work 23 hours a day, 7 days a week. And I remember, again, there was a time, and again, this just tells how broken both of us were coming in, that we were confused and frustrated. But Richie had decided that on work days, we were going to be up and on the work site by 7 a.m. And I was like, okay, that's reasonable. I didn't agree to it, but he just said that's what we're going to do. And I said, okay. But sometimes we had a toddler, and sometimes I wasn't ready at 7. And he would be very, very angry at me. And I would be like, hey, well, I didn't exactly agree to this. He's like, no, this is the plan, and we're going to do the plan. Well, I guess maybe kind of. I really don't remember having a conversation about this plan. He's like, no, this is, if we're going to get the work done, we've only got 3 months, and we've got to build this house in 3 months. Did I mention we were the work crew? We had a contractor who is a family member who came and gave us directions. And then he left, and we kept working. Because I know a lot about building staircases. I do now. I can build a staircase. Just if you ever need one, I know how now. But
she also does electrical, if you need,
Yeah, that's a whole different story. I had a very big blunder this last week that was frustrating. You moved our notes, and I'm not sure where we are. Where did we go? Oh, that's your color.
You were leading into that.
I was. Mm-hmm. I was just going to take that whole thing.
You're doing
Let
a
me
good
finish
job.
setting
That's
it up.
a good setup.
So the 7 o'clock a.m., I didn't agree to it, but there was a pastor in Oregon that we had done some work with, trying to learn how do you forgive each other for all the stuff that came before. And so I called Gary because he knows us, and wanted to get his input. And I'm like, Gary, there's something going on, and I can't figure it out, because I had brought this 7 a.m. wake-up call, or not wake-up, on the site call, to Richie, and we were sitting on the scaffolding. We were watching the sun go down with a baby monitor, And I brought it to Richie and said, this isn't really working well for me, and I feel like maybe you're exerting a little too much control in this area. And I was trying really hard to be really tactful and really empathetic. And he looked at me very compassionately and said, honey, you're being manipulative right now, and you need to stop. I will not tolerate that in our home. And I went, I have no idea what just happened. I am so confused. And that's why I called Gary and said, Gary, I'm so confused. And I laid out the story, and he said, no, there is something very wrong. I will call Richie.
So he did. In fact, we had just walked onto the job site one morning about this time of year.
It was Sunday.
It was a Sunday, wasn't it? We'd just gotten onto the job site and kind of, getting the air compressor running and getting ready to go to work. And my phone rings. And so I walk away from the job site, and it's Pastor Gary on the other end of the line. And he says something that was, I thought, kind of uncharacteristic for him at the time. He says, Richie, I'm on my way to camp meeting, so I don't have much time, but... And then he said these words to me, and I'm going to read them so I can get them exactly right. He said, Richie, you are he said, I've been talking to Timmy, and based on what I've heard from her and what I've seen of the two of you, he said, Richie, you are spiritually and emotionally abusive to your wife, and it has to stop.
And just so you know, I was terrified at this point. That wasn't like a liberating statement. It was like oh, neat, we have cliffs on our property. I'm going to go sit at the bottom of them by myself.
I ended up going and sitting at the top of the cliff while I'm talking to Gary, and tears start running down my eyes because, to be honest, people, this is the first time, I believe, in our whole journey that anybody had pointed the finger at me and said, Richie, there's an issue with you. It's the
Actually,
first time.
my therapists had said there was a problem with you.
Yeah, but I couldn't hear them, so they didn't count. I tuned them. That's true. You're right. And I tuned them out. So this is the first time I heard someone say, Richie, there's a problem, and it's you. I guess that would be a better way. And I couldn't tune Gary out. He had earned, through relationship, my trust. And so I couldn't dismiss him. And I began to weep. And, if he had just said, Richie, you're spiritually and emotionally abusive, it has to stop, and hang up, I don't know what I would have done with that, but that's not where he stopped. And instead, he hit me right between the eyes, and then he continued with these words. He said, Richie, I see gold in you, and God's not finished with you, but this has to end. It cannot continue the way it has. Now, I'd like to say to all of you this morning that was the beginning of the transformation of Richie Brower. But that would be a lie. What it was for me and how I was processing the world at the time was I was willing to admit after that conversation that things were more serious than I had believed. And probably if you had asked me that day, I would have said, Timmy's in deeper trouble than I realized. It's probably where that would have gone. But it did wake me up to the point of realizing, actually things are more serious than I was thinking, and then start processing what now based on that understanding.
And I think it's important to highlight how much we were both suffering. It wasn't like Richie was on his high horse and he was just condescending and I was suffering. We were both suffering at immeasurable levels. And I'm sure many of you, if we sat down with you, we would hear your own stories of where you've sat down and sat in immeasurable suffering as well. Shortly after this story, a couple months later, we found ourselves in a still darker valley. Our church plant had actually been disintegrating while we were on sabbatical, and they didn't want us to know. They wanted to protect our sabbatical. And so we came back to a church that was half the size 3 months later than it had been. That was a little stressful for us since we had birthed this baby 3 years prior. And we had a toddler ourselves, a house that was partially built, because who were we to think we could build a house in 3 months and actually live in it? That's so silly. But we were optimistic. That's still a fault and a gift that we have. And so at that point, my trauma was hitting a peak at that point in just like day-to-day life from nightmares, panic. I was bordering on an eating disorder because when I start feeling stressed, I stop eating. And so we decided I was going to go away and do some intensive counseling to see if I could pull myself out, because basic functioning was I was still able to show up on the work site and work really hard. I just couldn't eat to supply the fuel to do the work. And so our church plan is disintegrating. I left Richie with Caleb, our oldest, who was just under 2, and I was gone, and we had no family around to help. Our close friends from the church plant, swung in to help care for Caleb and that kind of thing, as I tried to go and figure out some of the me portion of us. And then the plan was for Richie to join me for the last couple weeks.
So just a few nights before Timmy left for this intensive, we had a couple of friends over that she knew from her work at the women's shelter operated by Union Gospel Mission in Spokane. They came over to our house just to visit, and they knew that she was going away. I'm not sure what they knew about that, but they knew. And somehow the conversation kind of turned to that, and the husband, Jerry, as he sat there and listened, and mainly his wife was doing the talking, and Timmy, and he was listening, and just kind of, he's sensing there's more to the story. And then he just quietly, in what I now know to be his trademark style, he just quietly looked at me there in the living room of our little bungalow and said, "Richie, you're the key." And I hated him for that. Because what I heard him say was, "Richie, it's your fault." That's what I heard. It's not what he said, it's what I heard. And I hated him for that, and I immediately went, la, 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 and tuned out anything else he had to say. So Timmy went away and started the intensive. I joined her for a week. It was a disaster, I think that would be safe to say, because I cheerfully dismissed all of their input from these Christian counselors, because they weren't Adventists, so they clearly didn't understand our culture and therefore couldn't speak into my marriage.
And because they said, yes, that is what you said, and because they said that living in the hinterboonies of nowhere would likely kill me. And so Richie's response is, well, they clearly don't have the spirit of prophecy, so what do they know?
They were not hearing the voice of God, or they would have known better about country living.
Yep.
Yeah.
So we're just telling you a true story. So
Anybody uncomfortable with this story yet?
So that you can know you're not alone, because you may or may not have gone to these depths.
So we're here.
We're actually right here. Nope,
yeah.
We're right there.
So after I went and joined Timmy for a week, and we had this train wreck of a week with all these counselors trying desperately to help me see the light, help us, I came home and she stayed there, and the idea was that she'd be home fairly shortly. And I'm feeling the pressure, right? Because our church plant is imploding around me. We had a business meeting while she was away. I literally had members yelling at me in this church business meeting as a pastor, and I've got our little almost 2-year-old, and I'm just like, I need some backup here. I wanted her to come back for all the wrong reasons, let's be honest. But I was looking forward to her coming back, not because I wanted to get to work on our marriage, because I wanted some child care support. So then I get a phone call, and Timmy says, Richie, I'm realizing while I've been over here that the issue that I came to work on is actually not the core issue that I need help on. I can't really make progress on this eating issue when our marriage and our home is in chaos. So I've made a decision. This is what she told me on the phone. I will be happy to come home as soon as you can tell me that you have accountability. She had been in a ladies' accountability group for, I think, 2 or 3 years at that point, and had been really beneficial to her. And she'd occasionally say, you ought to do something, but I didn't feel the need because it was her issue, right? So I was happy for her to be getting all the help she could. So now she looks at me and she says, I'll come home when you've got a man that you're meeting with. And she said, I don't care, it's a pastor, a counselor, whoever. And I don't know if you mentioned Jerry in that conversation, I don't remember. But as I processed, let me tell you, my initial reaction was not one of joy. I was angry. I was mad. That pushed every button I had right there. And as I thought about it, I thought, well, who would I feel comfortable sharing with? And there was only one man in my world who had offered to walk with me and talk about real life things, and that was the jerk who had said to me, hey, Richie, you're the key, right? That was the guy. He was the only person. And I'm like, and one of these days I need to actually ask him, so what was my tone of voice exactly when I called you? Because I'm sure it was not one of enthusiasm, but I called up Jerry, the jerk, and said, hey, you mentioned that maybe we could talk. Is that offer still open? He said, yeah. And that began a journey with my dear friend. Now, let me tell you a little just quickly about Jerry. Jerry is not a counselor. He's a godly man who suffered a lot in his own life. He's been in the Air Force, and he is the director of the Men's Recovery Program at the Union Gospel Mission. So that began a journey where every day, once a week, Seventh-day Adventist pastor Richie Brower walked into the Union Gospel Mission surrounded by all the other broken, addicted men, and spent 3 hours sitting with Jerry, who I affectionately call Jerry the Jerk. And we had an agenda that never varied. There was only 2 items on the agenda. We did this for 10 years. 10 years that Jerry the Jerk and I spent together. Anybody curious what we talked about for 3 hours? Did you even know that 2 men could talk for 3 hours a week after? I know, Dan, right? It's like, what? It wasn't hard, I can tell you that. We'd go 2 to 3 hours every week, and the agenda never changed. There were 2 items on the agenda, and only 2, and those were this: how to be a godly man and how to love our wives well. That was it. And I would go in week after week. This woman, you would think, she came home, by the way. I was grateful for that. Glad to see her. Happy to have her there. And we started, I started working and meeting with Jerry, and you would think that she would be filled with gratitude and love and affection. No. It got worse. She started pushing every single button that had ever been an issue in our relationship ever. One after another. And so we'd have fight after fight, and I'd walk into Jerry's office, and I'd go in all self-righteous because I knew she was in the wrong this time, and finally he'd take my side. And I'd walk in, and I'd say, you wouldn't believe what she did. This was so awful. And he'd look at me and say, so Richie, what did Timmy need from you in that experience? How would Jesus have related to Timmy in that experience? And week after week, this is why we call him the jerk, I would walk in right and I'd go home and apologize.
So I started bringing up the difficult issues on Monday night, knowing he had Jerry at 7 a.m. on Tuesday morning. Let's just get a rhythm.
That's how it went.
So while I was away, and then as I was coming back, it became apparent that our church plant was not going to survive what happened while we were on sabbatical. And so I came home, Richie and I talked, and we both agreed that God was leading us to actually step down from being the pastoral couple. Because we went into, our conference administration was just stunning to us. They were generous, they were thoughtful, they listened well. And, we sat down with our president, who I had known since I was a tiny little thing. And he's like, well, we've got this church opened. It's like, 200 miles in that direction. We've got that one. Your church planters, they wouldn't take you, actually. You could go to that one. We just kept talking. And we looked at the options, and not all of them were awful. Because let's face it, not all congregations are created equal. In our conference, I'm just going to leave that. That wasn't a very pastoral thing to say, sorry. That's not the reason we didn't move. We, at that point, I had a counselor, he had Jerry, we had mentors who we were meeting with for 3 to 5 hours every other week. And we had help with Caleb, so we could go to these things. And if we moved, we'd move into nothing. We would have no support system. This is before Zoom was invented. And so, we could keep gainful employment, which is really handy, or we could keep the people who were pouring into us. And we had a pasture, so surely we can make a living with benefits off a pasture. And so we felt like God was leading us to step aside for our church's sake, for our sake, and we chose to stay without gainful employment. We had a plan, but let me tell you, it was a loose plan. And
turned out to be a very poor plan, actually.
it did, actually, yep. But you know what? God uses a lot of creative environments, doesn't he? And so we stepped aside and we became market gardeners from a pasture. Notice I didn't say a field. I said a pasture. Have you ever tried to make a pasture go to growing what you need to survive in one season?
Some of these, we got a lot of farmers here. They probably have.
They probably have. I wouldn't recommend it.
They may have had tractors too.
Oh. And maybe fences. Because the deer ate some really nice organic produce and I got mine from Walmart. So that's how that went. And I can truthfully say I don't like poverty at all. But God used that season in incredible ways because we were going to be organic farmers, which meant we had this great big grassy field that we were trying to grow things in. And we were on our hands and knees for a ridiculous amount of hours every day, picking things out of the ground, trying to make things grow. And isn't that what we were trying to do here as well? Picking the weeds out. And you know, when you're on your hands and knees in the dirt for hours a day, God can do very powerful things to humble you, which is what we both needed.
So as all of this is unfolding and we're trying to get our farm, which we named Flying Pigs Farm.
Because when pigs fly, demons are fleeing, and that was our prayer.
Yep. So based on the story from the Gospels, right? Flying Pigs Farm. As all this is unfolding, I'm meeting with Jerry the Jerk every week. And he was patient but firm. And as we started talking and journeying, and he would poke and prod and ask questions and listen patiently, I began to see. That was a huge piece because I hadn't been able to see before. I could see Timmy's part, but none of mine. I began to see how I was contributing and how maybe I could change some of these things. And I began to pray. I'd been praying about our marriage for years, but my prayer had always been, Lord, help Timmy. Bless Timmy. Help her come out of this hole she's in. And now Jerry challenged me to pray a really different, radical prayer. And he said, Richie, I want to invite you to start praying and ask God to teach you to love Timmy well. Wow. Now, I know you've got prayer ministry here in Dakota Conference. I've seen the signs and stuff, and it's fantastic. But I'll just tell you, there are a few prayers that I know, without a shadow of a doubt, God is eager to answer. And one of them is, Lord, teach me how to love my spouse well. That is a prayer that God is eager to answer. And we all could benefit by praying that prayer regularly. And I began to pray that prayer, and things began to change. And as God began to change my heart, a miracle began to take place in our marriage. There's no other word to describe it. From the darkness that you've heard us describe, God begins to birth something. And as I begin to listen to the voice of God and learn to recognize those promptings, teaching me how to love this woman, because he made her. He created her. He knows every piece of her story. So he can guide me to love her in ways that would minister to her heart. And as I began to listen and follow his lead, things began to happen that were amazing.
And I don't know how many of you who have danced with hope, I'm guessing all of you, but when you start to taste that there is more than what you've had, it's terrifying. It's horrifying. So I did what I think most self-respecting women do. I tried to stop it. Because he'd had stints of good behavior before, and it always stopped, and it was always worse after because I had tasted something different. So I decided if this is just going to be a stint of good behavior, let's get it over with so I don't have to live in this horrible limbic space of almost fight and flight. And so, as Richie said, I pushed every hot button that we'd ever had. Let's bring up finances on Monday night. Let's bring up finances and let's talk about it. And that's always hard because at this point we're living in poverty. And I mean that as a literal thing, not like a figurative thing. And okay, well, that didn't go too badly. Ooh, I know a good one. Let's talk about who owns time. Because we have a child. At this point, we probably had 2 children. And who owns time? Because whoever owns time gets to be the one who tells the other what they have time to do. Ah, that's a good hot button in our household. And so I brought it up, and he's like, no, I think we can work with that. What does that mean? He just wasn't responding to me the way, usually that kind of thing, like, and I wouldn't say I wanted him to be angry. I just wanted to get done with the happy part if we were going to be going to the unhappy part again. Because it's so hard. I mean, and we're talking neurochemically, it's hard. We get used to certain rhythms in our body that are neurochemical, and so my adrenaline was like right there on the cusp, just waiting to kick in. And then it had to wait longer, and my anxiety was going through the roof, knowing that we were probably on the cusp of awfulness. And then we didn't go, and I had to wait longer. And then there was the day, and I remember it because we were washing dishes, and I was washing and handing him, and he was drying. The kids were sleeping. And keep in mind, we're living in 574 square feet at this point, and there's 4 of us. So we had moved our queen bed into the living room and just gotten rid of a couch because we could no longer, our youngest at that point was wanting to nurse about every 90 minutes all night long because I was only 2 feet from him. And I'm like, I can't do this. I am not getting any sleep. And I'm a really committed sleeper. So we ended up just, and our baby, who was 3, he's now in the loft. He climbs a 10-foot ladder to get to his room, and loved it, by the way, and never had a mishap, except the time he didn't make it to the bathroom in time, and that was a waterfall. That's a different story, too. I just say that partly because there's always humor in the midst of the difficulty, and we kind of have to balance both. But I remember one day, I was doing dishes, Richie was drying, and out of the clear blue, he's like, I have wounded you in so many ways, and he named a specific way, and he's like, I can't imagine what that would be like for you. Would you just tell me what it's been like? And I looked at him, and I'm like, is this a game? Is this a ploy? Is this some kind of bait and switch? What is going on here? Because we had jokes in our church. Have you guys taken like the spiritual gifts inventories? And one of them is compassion.
Spiritual gift is compassion.
One of them.
I've heard of that one.
And I rate really high on that one. Anyone want to place a guess on what Richie's score on compassion was?
Nobody?
It's on a 0 to 10 scale. Just make a wild guess. What would his score be? A 2,
you were
a
so
0?
generous. Thank you.
The person who said 0 would be accurate.
That's right. I scored a big 0.
He got a great big old 0. And we had jokes about how many compassion-oriented people on church board did we have to have to balance him. And what was the final tally?
6.
Right. So, again, all these foibles are also gifts. It's our wiring and our wounding often come together. But I looked at him as he said, would you tell me how it's been to live with me? And you know what? I don't feel the need to beat someone with a 2x4 when they are coming to me gently. And I'm like, well, babe, it's been kind of hard. I feel dismissed a lot. I feel like I'm the brunt of your anger. Wherever you're angry, I get it. I feel like when you feel like you're failing, it becomes my fault. Just started listing these things. And with tears in his eyes, he's like, honey, I am so sorry. I have created that environment. He said, and I want you to know, I'll probably do it again, but that is not the man I want to be, and I am committed to being someone else. And I will keep working, and I will keep talking so that we can keep growing this. We are going to give a different legacy to our children. We will give a different legacy to our children. Well, you know what? Sign me up. Let's give a different legacy to our children than the one that was given to us. And so I started having to adjust because he was becoming a new creation. So what was I going to become in response?
Wow. one of the things that I really had to work on, and Jerry the Jerk helped me, was learning how to really listen to Timmy. And we discovered that if Timmy was talking about how other people had hurt her, I could tune in and I could listen pretty well and do pretty good. But the moment she started to share a story about how I had hurt her, I would literally physically fall asleep. I fell asleep in Taco Bell one time when she started to share something that was reflecting negatively on me. So you should be amazed that I'm up here not sleeping right now as we're telling all these stories.
Do you want to know how much therapy? No.
Years and years. So we would be having conversations, and a lot of times we'd be laying in bed talking, and she would start to pour out her heart about some way that I had hurt her, and I would fall asleep. And it was frustrating to her. So she looked at me and said, "You've got to figure out how to stay awake when I'm talking to you. This feels so dismissive." So I went to Jerry the Jerk. That was probably a Monday night. And I went to Jerry the Jerk the next morning. And I said, "I keep falling asleep when Timmy's talking to me. What do I do?" And he said, "Stand up." Okay, so you have to understand, at that point, our bed was in the loft, but it wasn't like a normal loft. We were living in this little 474 square foot cottage while we built our house across the driveway, and the roof of the loft went like this, and it wasn't tall enough for even a short person like me to stand up fully. So it happened a few nights later, we're laying in bed, and Timmy starts to pour out her heart to me, and she sees my eyes start to droop. She goes, "Boom, wake up!" And I'm like, "Oh, I'm supposed to stand up." So I jumped out of bed and I stand up. And I'm standing there and I'm listening and I'm awake. And I can tell you when you're bent over like this, standing up, you don't fall asleep. And I started learning new habits. Why? Because I was committed to creating oneness, and I wanted her to know that her heart mattered. And I don't really, most of the time, want to fall asleep when I'm being criticized, although the temptation is still there.
And I don't hit him very often. Honey, should we talk about this later? We've both learned communication skills. At this point, we'd been on this journey for years. Like, again, we're interspersing it with humor, and there was always humor. But I would say at this point, we were like 8-9 years into our marriage. Does that sound about right? 9-10 maybe. And I realized I had to make some choices about how I was going to relate to Richie, because in a lot of ways, in my circle, and even how I related to him, I loved him dearly, but he was a perpetrator in my life. He was in the list of bad men, and I was still committed, but we had grown past that. That wasn't true anymore. He was changing, he was listening, he was growing, he was becoming gentler. I would say he made it up to a 3 on the 0 to 10 scale, which is significant. And I'm actually not mocking in that. I'm being serious. It was
that is 300% growth.
At least, maybe more. And I remember I was driving to my accountability group one day. And just kind of as, I'm in the car by myself, it's shocking. And I'm thinking about what I'm going to talk about. And I'm like, well. And I realized I didn't have anything bad to report. I didn't have any story that was really harmful or even hurtful. And all I had was nice things to say, actually. And I remember feeling kind of confused. Like, who am I if I'm not... If my identity isn't in opposition to him? Does that make sense? Like, who am I going to be if I get to just stand on my own and not be pushing against anyone? It's never happened in my life so far. I didn't realize that at the time, but it was true. And I went to my group of girls, my 2 other women I was meeting with, and I'm like, I need help. I don't actually know exactly who I am now, because I don't get to define myself off of him anymore. And I'm going to need help to kind of navigate what that's going to become, because I don't want to be a victim. I don't want to hinder what's happening in our household by my keeping him in a role he's not even doing anymore. Because that was my temptation, to be like, oh no, he's still the bad guy. I'm still kind of in the right-ish. You've heard some of my stories yesterday. Not very right, but a little right occasionally. And but I realized that we were on the cusp of something very good, and I didn't want to be the one that now hinders its growth.
And that night, Timmy gave me an incredible gift. I mean, if you think about this, you've heard enough of the story, and there's more to tell. We could keep you here for the rest of the day, but we won't. The things that I have done and said, Timmy could justifiably hold me in contempt for the rest of my life, right? I have earned it, right? But Timmy made a choice, basically, to release me from my identity that I had earned as an angry, abusive husband. And in that moment, she opened the door to that jail cell and gave me my freedom. Freedom to become a new man and to have a new identity in our home. That was a huge gift that I can never repay. We do a whole talk on forgiveness. We have a whole video series on forgiveness. It's powerful, and there's lots of pieces to that, but I would just say that that was a powerful gift she gave to me that allowed me to walk free and step into my own new identity as I tried to grow as a godly man. No, I'll do that. You know, it's interesting. Speaking of identity, I don't know if any of you can relate, but I'm guessing one or two can. My identity had been wrapped up in my work. So, you know, who are you? Well, I'm the pastor of this church or this church plant, or I'm the church planning coordinator for our conference, or whatever. That was my identity. And suddenly I find myself in a place where I'm not a pastor. I don't have a normal job. I'm failing as a farmer. And I remember the day we were at Camp Mivenden. I think I must have been camp pastor for the week or something at a family camp. And we're at an event just kind of hanging out with some of the families that are there for the week. And this one man, we're getting acquainted. And you know how it is, guys. When you meet another man, what's the first two pieces of information we exchange? What's your name? Yeah, what's your name and what do you do, right? So we get through the name part, which he knew mine, and I'm learning his. And then he says, so what do you do? And I look at him, and I had this, probably the lowest moment of my existence, right? I looked at him and went, nothing. And that was the moment when I realized my identity has been tied up in what I do, and now God is calling me to a new identity. And the identity that he was calling me to was as a man who is learning to love his wife and to love his family and to lead his home and to serve. And it's been a long journey. It's not done. But God is recreating that identity in me as a man.
And I just want to say, it wasn't that Richie wasn't working hard during this whole time. He was applying for jobs. He couldn't, even after being a camp director, he couldn't get a secretarial job for a camp director. It was like God put his hand over us and said, kids, you are in time out. To the dirt you shall go. And I mean, because he applied, Richie has connections, and I don't mean that in a weird way, but in like we've traveled a lot, and he's worked in a lot of different places, in the NAD, and no one would even call him back. People who have mentored him for like half his life never even called him back when he called and said, hey, by the way, I'm open to job positions. Okay, he has way more relational collateral than that. I think God blocked every single phone call he made. Because what's the likelihood that no one would call him back? I think God wanted us to suffer, actually. And I don't mean that from a ha ha ha, but from a, oh honey, you need to just stay here for a little bit. And, you know, we share this story, and this is only the first half of our marriage. The second half is less dramatic, but still painful at times. But we share this part specifically because we all have this idea as if we could just have this idyllic situation, maybe at a retreat somewhere with mountains and flowers and bees and rainbows, then we could heal. And it would be very pastoral in its gentle process. And this was not a gentle process. This was horrible. And I wouldn't wish it on even people I dislike. And yet, Richie should have been crushed, as the way he metabolizes being the provider for our home, the way he relates to his own identity and his job and all these things, he should have been crushed. And instead, he kept pushing in towards me with more and more gentleness and more tenderness. I don't know if any easier environment would have let me know it was real. So I actually found myself, in retrospect, not very much in the moment, let's be honest, really grateful for how incredibly hard that season was. And, you know, if we were to tell you the second half of the story, we would say that there were ups and downs. There have been times where things have been really glorious, and times where I went to our counselor, because we still have a counselor of our own, who we really like. And I remember going to him once and saying, I have no control over this situation. I can't make him do what needs to happen for our marriage. And he looked at me and said, you're right, you are absolutely powerless here. And I went, oh, because I was expecting him to give me something. He's like, no, Richie has to make his own choices. You are powerless. And I went, can't you do something then? And I know Richie's had his moments where he's like, Timmy has to do her own process. He can't speed it up. He can't slow it down. And we've had pain. But I can also say that this man right here is the best man I've ever known. And that's coming from, as I said yesterday, accusing him of being the worst traits of both of my fathers. I can truthfully look at him and say, there is no one I would rather do life with. There is no one I would rather parent our children with. There is no one I want to build a bus with. And by the way, my children and my stepdad are taking out the seats to the bus right now. So, Isn't God amazing in his redemptive power? We've given some version of this seminar literally hundreds of times. And we've had many people come up to us and say, why are you guys even together? You should have been divorced so many times over. And we have spent countless hours talking about that because we actually can't tell you why. Is it because I'm really persevering? Well, yeah, but not that persevering. Could we say it's because he's really stubborn and committed? Yeah, but not that much. We really can't tell you why we're together other than God has intervened. We have looked for a formula because we have sat with so many people in pain, and there's got to be a formula. And we can't find it other than we persevered and God intervened. And we came even to a new place this year in January, I guess it was December. We still have some what we call holdout areas in our marriage. The ones where they're not that bad, but they're also not that good, but they're not hurting us on a daily basis, so we just kind of leave them alone and hope they don't rear their heads. And we decided to conquer one of them without being in crisis this year. And it has been a little painful, but it's a different kind of pain. It's a pain because we chose it, and we chose it while we had resources, like in our hearts. Because normally you wait till some big crisis comes and whacks you on the head with a 2x4, and you're reeling, saying, we've got to deal with this. But at that point, you're in pain. You are suffering. And we kind of hatched a plan with our therapist and said, so we kind of want to deal with this thing that we don't have to deal with probably for the rest of our lives. But it's keeping us from the level of oneness that we desire. We want more. We know we can have more, I think. It was that. It really was that. We've got a good therapist. And he's like, I think you can have more. He's like, I have watched you over years now. You guys can still have more. And so we decided to be like David and Goliath, because David didn't sit in a corner and wait for Goliath to come whack him with a sword. He ran to the battle. And so we decided, with a little bit of fear and trepidation, we're going to run to this battle. And we made a strategic plan. We got our resources, both financial and people, together, and we made a plan. And you know what? It hasn't gone it hasn't gone super well. It hasn't gone as far as we were hoping.
It's gone pretty well.
And he's still the best man I know. And we're conquering one of the hardest problems that we've had since our honeymoon. So that's not a finished story. Come and hear us in a couple years and we'll tell you the rest of it. I don't know. I'm really grateful that you all invited us here so we could tell our story again, because it's been a while. I was even, as we were going over our notes last night one more time, and going, man, I barely remember the me in this story. Isn't that kind of nice? Because she is far away. Because God is gracious.
I think if I was just listening to you kind of wrap up the last half and even the last year, and just thinking, when we started engaging around year 8 of our marriage, I think if I chose a word for that time, it would be tenacity, probably. We were just holding on for dear life, and it was rough and messy. And I think if I were to choose a phrase for today, it would be determined engagement. That we're intentionally pushing in, because we've made a decision, and some of that decision is prompted by you. Because for us, it's a matter of integrity. If we're going to come talk to you, it matters to us that we continue to grow, which means we have to be intentional. So will we always have a therapist? Yeah, we will. Probably not every week. But I think we will, at least on call, because we don't ever want to stop growing, and that's a tool that's been helpful to us. So anything you want to say to tie it up? All right. Thank you for listening to our story. As we've said earlier, for those of you who joined us this morning, if you have questions, you're welcome to ask us in the hallways. We're going to be around. But we have a Q&A time. Where's the box? Right there? Is that the box? You're welcome to put any question you want anonymously in the box for the Q&A panel discussion. What is this? Tomorrow afternoon, right? At 3. Yep. So there you go. You have options. We'd like to pray and close out our time together. Father in heaven, thank you that you are still on your throne, and that our story is not the only story you are weaving, that there are many, many stories in this room that you are right now intentionally weaving, working, healing, binding. God, I pray that you will continue to work in our home and in every home represented in this room, that we will experience the power of your presence, the healing of your grace, and that we will have testimonies to share with our family, our friends, our neighbors, to say, I know a God who is living and real, and he changes things. We ask these things in your precious name. Amen.